So, a lot of times when you think about encounters, you think about encounters as a player. What the player would do, kind of the three action economy, maybe spells, maybe the order of operations, initiative, how turns would go, basically from the player's perspective. But did you ever wonder how a GM runs an encounter? Or maybe you were a new GM looking for tips on how to do an encounter. Well, there is a section in the player's handbook, and I'm sure it's going to be coming into the game mastery guide once we get to the remaster. But I thought I'd cover a little bit about what's stated for running an encounter as a game master. So, my name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. The encounter mode is without a doubt the most structured mode of play. I pretty much don't get any comments about how to run or what to do in encounter mode with the structure specifically, like I do with exploration or downtime, and mechanically, it's really, really solid. You start with an encounter between the party and the opposing force, and then call for initiative rolls during exploration before you move into the actual encounter itself. And then the turns begin round after round until the combat is settled due to defeat, surrender, or one party escaping. One party's going to come out on top, and one's going to lose. If you're the game master, how do you play the creatures? Are they intelligent? Would they know the strengths and weaknesses of the party? Have they fought before? Are they a team? Do they have their own tactics? If this was a boss who had been getting reports from maybe underlings as you were going through their keep or their dungeon, maybe it's a possibility. But in general, the creatures aren't going to have a lot of information about the party. So, with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the encounters from the game master's perspective. So, as far as stakes go, the book mentions stakes, and there should be stakes to a game, but don't confuse stakes with encounter level. Sometimes a trivial or low encounter can be good for the party and may be good for the narrative. And watch how many severe and extreme encounters you add to an adventure. Some tables might like to play that way, and that's perfectly fine, but it can be taxing on the resources of the party and the players at the table. But when you're talking about stakes themselves, this is a combat, so there is always a chance of a moderate or high stakes, and all are played in a step-by-step time frame to reflect that. As far as the time scale, encounter mode is highly structured and by far the most structured mode within Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In general, unless there is some mechanism like a test or a condition to be met, it's going to proceed in rounds until the outcome is determined. While there are other types of encounters, like social encounters, that can have rounds of any length. For combat, 1 minute consists of 10 rounds, with each combat round 6 seconds long. But in a social encounter, you might decide a verbal confrontation or conversation proceeds in minute long or longer rounds to give each speaker enough time to make a solid point. It doesn't necessarily mean that there needs to be some type of stopwatch at the table to time how long someone could talk, but it's more for timekeeping to determine how long the encounter took place in the adventuring day. Then we get into the actions and reactions. In a combat encounter, each participant's turn is broken into discrete actions, and participants can use reactions like when a trigger occurs, like a reactive strike or attack of opportunity, pre remaster, or in a social encounter, reactions can occur, but their triggers are usually more descriptive and less tactical. And I'm thinking of things that you might get from feats like Glad Hand or Halfling Luck if you happen to roll poorly. Now we'll talk a little bit about choosing the adversary's actions. Now, players who work together a lot generally tend to be efficient, but the opponents might not. As the GM, you are role playing and controlling the foes and their tactics. Most creatures are going to know basic strategies like flanking or focusing on one target, but they are going to act on emotion and blunders just like players, and even maybe more so than the players, because the players are the ones that in general are coming into their house in order to have a conflict, or they are trying to overtake a city or overtake a keep or whatever the players are defending. So, generally speaking, the creatures are going to be acting on their emotions more so than the players. The player's party might have been together for countless hours of combat and generally know what the capabilities are and what they're going to be doing next, while the creatures you are portraying are probably not that organized. And if they are, their level or template might need to be adjusted in order to make it a little bit more realistic for the party. So when a creature is picking targets, you would use the creature's knowledge, not the GM's knowledge. For instance, a monster might use a fear ability on a cleric with a strong will save, as that is what they might do to an unknown adversary and won't necessarily know the attributes, saves, or skills of classes. But the adversaries aren't fools either. They might go into a combat not knowing anything, but they learn, plan, and study players just like players learn, plan, and study fighting the creatures. Usually, they aren't going to attack a knocked out character, mainly because that character is no longer a threat. Even if they know the character might return, they're always, generally speaking, going to go towards the active threat, just like a player's party would. And only the cruelest focus on downed foes over these immediate threats. Managing adversaries balances their nature and game drama. So, one of the recommendations they had from the book was imagine encounters like movie fights. If a fighter taunts a fire giant to save a wizard, the smart move is hitting the wizard. But is it actually the best thing to do? Maybe the giant attacking the irritating fire is going to be more enjoyable, both for the GM and the players themselves, and might make more sense in the narrative and in the story. There are going to be times when you're in an adventure, in a campaign, when the players are going to be able to bypass encounters. Maybe they found a different way around. Maybe they talked their way through something. What do you do if the party managed to avoid a fight or talk their way out of trouble? Does that mean that they don't gain experience from that encounter? No, they actually do get the experience, especially if they did something unique or creative in order to get past it. So you don't want to leave them behind in experience points or cause them to miss important information or treasure. We're going to read a little passage from the book here, but in the case of XP, the guidelines are simple. If the player characters avoided the challenge through smart tactical play, a savvy diplomatic exchange, clever use of magic, or another approach that required ingenuity and planning, award them normal XP for the encounter. If they did something that took only a moderate effort or was a lucky break, like finding a secret passage and using it to avoid a fight, award them XP for a minor or moderate accomplishment. So it's generally a pretty good guideline, as experience in overcoming a problem does not need to be through combat. After all, in real life, you don't get experience just by beating things up. You get experience by overcoming them, however you do overcome them. Now, in an adventure that's more freeform or has multiple ways to get to locations, like a sprawling dungeon with multiple paths, there might be no reward for bypassing an encounter because doing so was trivial or just luck. You kind of have to think on your feet if information or items get skipped when players bypass these encounters. First, you want to look for another reasonable place in the adventure to place the information or the item. If it makes sense, you can move the original encounter to another part of the adventure. Put it in an empty room, a hallway, or even make that particular encounter a roaming encounter that the players just happen upon, and give the player characters a major advantage for bypassing the encounter in the first place. Now, encounters don't go on forever, and there's always going to be a point where the encounter ends. So, a combat encounter usually ends when all enemies are defeated or knocked out. Then, initiative order isn't needed anymore. The surviving side can take time to ensure down foes stay incapacitated. However, if any player characters are in critical condition or in an urgent situation, like maybe they're hanging over a ledge or they're in a precarious position on a bridge or something, you might still use combat rounds for their survival. You can conclude a fight if it's no longer challenging and the players are just dealing with weak enemies. However, you might want to avoid this if players have creative ideas or ongoing spells. You basically want to think of it like this. You would end a fight early if it prevents boredom, but not for fun denial. If they're just waiting on that 3-turn spell that they've been saving up in order to blow off, well, let them blow it off. There are various ways to finish a fight early. Enemies can surrender, an adversary might die before running out of hit points, or you can narrate an easy victory for the player characters. And if you are going to narrate an easy victory, you could ask, is it okay to end this fight kind of out of character to ensure that everybody's okay with it? Now, surrender can happen when most foes are defeated or through demoralizing spells or skills. And after a surrender, step out of the initiative order and have a brief negotiation about maybe mercy or consequences for the creature's actions. And these talks concern whether the winners spare the lives or eliminate the lives of the losers. Since the surrendering side usually has less influence, you need to keep the discussions concise. Now, the last thing I'd like to cover is fleeing enemies. So, chasing fleeing enemies can be pretty tricky. Players often want to pursue them in case they return as threats later, but kind of avoid going through this step by step as it can really slow down the game. If all the foes are fleeing, skip initiative, let each player choose one fleeing foe to chase and use an action or ability to catch them. You would want to compare their speeds, be it land, flying, swimming, whatever the environment determines. Consider the spells and abilities that both the players and the creatures have, and the creature's escape skills. If the pursuer catches up, resume combat and keep the initiative. If not, the quarry escapes for now. If the players decide to flee, it's usually fine. Set a destination and let them escape once everyone reaches it. But if they're slowed or pursued by faster enemies, well, then you're going to have consequences. And those consequences could be pretty dire because you are going to have your back to the creatures that are pursuing. Now, I hope this video on how a game master would approach an encounter was helpful, not just for game masters, but also for players as well. It kind of gives a player a view into basically what the game master is doing whenever the encounter is occurring. Usually, they're not just reading off a page and doing stats or necessarily trying to beat you down in the most brutal way possible. However, they are generally trying to act and role play as these characters. So, role playing is actually occurring on all sides during an encounter. Now, I do hope you like this video, and if you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.